Hello, everyone. My name is Erik D'Souza, and if you've seen me recently, I've been out promoting cold Canadian crime, but today we're going to do something a little different, and we're going back to BC to talk to three BC authors about a region actually in BC called the Kootenays. I've talked once before about Vancouver, and people, I guess, that's usually associate Vancouver with BC, but it's a very large province and there's different regions, so I'm happy today to have three authors who can represent those regions. I'm going to give you each very quick bios. I had to edit them down to just a few lines. So let's first introduce Iona Whishaw. Hi, Iona. How are you today?
Wonderful. Thank you.
So Iona has been a youth worker, a social worker, a teacher, and an award-winning high school principal who continued her writing throughout her work life. Receiving a master's in creative writing from UBC, Iona has published short fiction, poetry translation, and one children's book. The Lane Winslow Mystery Series is her first foray into adult fiction, and lucky for us mystery lovers, it has remained her genre of choice, and she's written 9 Winslow mysteries. I'm sure she's working on number 10, but the most recent published is Framed in Fire. Judy Toews. Judy, hi Judy. For her mystery purposes, she goes by J.G. Toews, also a graduate of UBC, a former teacher, nutritionist, columnist, and nonfiction author who's co-authored 3 books on nutrition. Set in Nelson, her debut novel, Give Out Creek, was shortlisted for the Arthur Ellis Award for Best Unpublished First Crime Novel by Crime Writers Canada, and her sophomore novel, Lucky Jack Road, finds reporter Stella Mosconi once again sort of drawing into the investigation with Sergeant Ben McKean. And lastly, we have Dave Butler. Hi, Dave.
Hello there.
So Dave Butler is a forester and biologist living in the shadows of the Rocky Mountains in British Columbia. He's the author of the Jenny Wilson Mystery Series. The first in this series, Full Curl, won the Arthur Ellis Award for Best Crime Novel in 2018 and was shortlisted for the Rakuten Kobo Emerging Writer Award for the mystery category. Since then, he's written 2 more Jenny Wilson mysteries, No Place for Wolverines and In Rhino We Trust. So those are our 3 authors joining us today. All right, so that's the most of my talking. Now let's hear from them. Let's start with Iona, since I introduced you first. What is your connection to the Kootenays? And also at the same time, pretend you're on the tourist board and tell us a little bit about the area.
My connection is that I lived in the along the Nelson strip of Kootenay Lake when I was a very small child, and my parents actually moved there from Kimberley. So you know, we have East and West Kootenays involved, and you know, it's just an unbelievably beautiful and yet still somewhat isolated place in some ways. I mean, it still takes an awful long time to get there. And so, yeah, that's my connection. And that's why I wanted to write about it, because my very early childhood, all my impressions come from living along Kootenay Lake in a place called Queens Bay.
And Judy, what's your connection?
Well, my connection is I moved with my late husband to Nelson in 1981 with an 8-week-old and a 2-year-old because we wanted somewhere nice to raise our family. And so 4 decades later, I was still there. I started writing mysteries there, and right away it struck me that not only is it a beautiful place, but it is isolated enough to be self-sufficient too, which makes it a fun place to live and also a fun place to write about.
Thank you. And Dave?
I guess a couple of things. One, I'm actually living in Cranbrook right now, so that's in the East Kootenays. That's if you look at the mountains behind me there, you pop over those and you'd actually be in Alberta, and then about half an hour south you'd be in Montana. So we're right at the southeast corner. I should also say that I'm in the Makas Tunaha, which is the traditional territory of the Tunaha peoples. And I'm also in the Shkwepnik Ulu, which is the traditional territory of the Shkwepton peoples. We actually live on the Rocky Mountain Trench, which is a fantastic piece of geography with the Rockies you'll see behind me, and then also the Purcells on either side of a pretty wide valley. The weather is beautiful here. The 4 seasons are amazing, and I just love the place and love being here. And it's a great place to write.
Sorry, I'm already going to stray from the questions I told you. The Kootenays is named after the Kootenay River, which I believe is also an indigenous people named it. Is that a different tribe? Does anybody know?
Kootenay is actually the white man's name for the Kootenay River, which was a Tunaha name for the river that starts in Canada, goes south in the U.S., then comes back and joins the Columbia right at Nelson, actually, where Judy and Iona both were.
And Iona, you mentioned that Nelson is sort of remote and far away. If you got in a car and started from, well, let's say you guys are in Vancouver, how long of a drive would we be talking about?
Good 9 hours, eh, Judy?
Yeah, to Nelson, a good 9 hours. Yeah, and it is a good 9 hours.
It's a good 9 hours. 9 hours. I went there in the fall, which is a fairly mild season here in Vancouver, for only a few days. And on my way back, I hit some of the worst snow driving. It was October that I'd ever encountered up in the mountains, you know, and so it really makes you think a bit. How isolated it actually still really is. I'm just amazed my parents ever ended up there, really, because they had come from South Africa, and my father was a geologist, and he was a mining geologist. So of course he got a job with a mining company in Kimberley, and then that's how we ended up there, because otherwise I don't know how people end up there. I really don't.
It's true, and it's an old community too, right?
Well, Nelson certainly is, and when we went there, it was a major government center, and it still does remain that. So the forestry and mining industries traditionally have been big there and have taken a lot of people there. And it's interesting because it's a beautiful place that people tend to think of as pristine, untouched. But that history of mining and forestry is what allows us to get up very high into the mountains and have beautiful hikes because there's access. So there's both sides of it there.
Yeah, I think I read they found silver there too. So
oh, yes,
they've been mining there for a long time, for at least 100 years, right?
Very big in the area. Yeah, still a little bit going on.
Oh, how about, what is it like? You mentioned you've all lived there at one point. What is the writing community like? And why don't we go in reverse order and start with Dave this time?
Well, I think, as I said, it's a really inspiring place because I think because of the 4 seasons are really intriguing, and each one's very different. The geography is really interesting, both East and West Kootenays, and there's some fun cultural differences between the two. We used to joke about having to get a passport to go across the pass to go from one side to the other because there was so many cultural differences. But I think, and going to Judy's point, is that there's so many interesting things going on here, and then particularly from a kind of a crime writing perspective, that there's all these layers of complexities. On the surface, it looks like one thing. Underneath, there might be some other things happening. And so from a writing perspective, it's a treasure trove of really interesting ideas and plot ideas and geographical locations and some really interesting characters to pull different pieces from to create characters around.
The other thing is that it's a very vibrant writing community. And I think that's been really important, especially when we were getting started, to Dave and I, maybe in particular, but I used to say you couldn't walk a block in Nelson without bumping into a writer. And certainly I found it fantastic when I had done a lot of report writing and nonfiction writing during my career, but when I got this wild idea to write fiction and mystery in particular, I found some wonderful mentors there. And there also is a quite wonderful Elephant Mountain Literary Festival, Elephant Mountain Literary Society, that got that going, that's been going for now about 11 years, and brings writers into the area, but there are a lot of people that are there. So it's a really supportive writing community.
It's interesting because I have not lived there as an adult. And because my books are really historical fiction, I'm looking at the whole area through this lens of my past. I mean, I wrote my original first book just so that I could go visit the Queen's Bay of my youth, you know, and remember the people who were there, many of whom were already absolutely ancient when I was 5 years old. So it just opened up an amazing whole other side of the Kootenays for me. You know, what it was like when it was a little rawer, when you know, some of these, the fruit growing. I mean, fruit growing was one of the big industries up and down the lake. And, you know, I was just young enough to remember when there was no bridge into Nelson and you had to take the ferry. And there was a big wharf where the paddle wheeler came, the steam paddle wheeler, and collected everybody's boxes of apples and all of that. So it's been really fun to go live there in that past, fictionalized a lot of it, but also as my books went on, beginning to look at some actual historical kinds of impacts of people in the past, including my last one, Framed in Fire, where, you know, we have an exploration of what actually happened to the Sinaiks people who used to live up and down there, right? So, you know, I think between the three of us, you've got this kind of nice totality of, you know, the vibrant life of Nelson today, the wonderful business of the wildlife that Dave covers so beautifully, and a little bit of the past. And also the Kootenays, I wanted to say this, a great place to die if you're writing.
Yeah, I know. I noticed the parallel between Judy and Iona. You both killed off people in boats, in canoes.
Only in books, Eric.
Yeah.
Let's make that perfectly clear. You know,
I'm hoping our watchers are assuming that.
and we also try to do, you know, do it in the gentlest possible way.
Yes.
You mentioned wildlife, and Dave, maybe you could speak to this the best really quickly. What kind of animals would you expect to see?
Well, we have pretty much everything here, but I think all, what's the famous word, charismatic megafauna. How do you like that one? But that basically means big things that are interesting. And so we have everything from, you know, mountain caribou, which is under threats from all sorts of things. We have mountain goats, we have grizzly bears. So they're kind of most of the big ones. And then you start to move down the scale, you get smaller animals that are really fascinating, like the wolverines, which, you know, we see occasionally here, which are amazing animals, and right down to the smaller, the fur bearers. And then lots and lots of wildlife. Both the valleys, East and West Kootenay, tend to be flyaways for major migrations of birds from north to south in different seasons of the year. So we'll get almost every bird species moving north and south through the valley at some point. It's really just a fascinating place from the perspective, and along with that, wildlife, or because of it, I suppose, the different habitats that we have here. This is why we have so much wildlife species, from the open grasslands in the valley bottoms to the high alpine and everything in between. It's just a really fascinating, very scenic place that's intriguing on many levels. How's that doing for the tourist board question?
Yeah, well, that's fascinating. Judy, do you think you missed any? We're testing him now. Did he miss anything?
I couldn't help thinking of elk because, well, there's just so many animals, but I remember once making that long 9-hour drive back from Vancouver to Nelson late in the day, and knowing that, you know, there's a curve on the highway just before you enter Nelson where there's an elk sign. And I thought, if I'm ever going to see elk on this road, it's tonight when I'm absolutely exhausted. And I slowed down and came around the corner, and there were elk all over the road.
Wow.
So yeah, it's exciting. And by the same token, one of the things I loved in the winter in Nelson is seeing migrating swans on their way through, because that's not sort of an everyday bird to me, but But in the winter, we could go out and there'd be snow on the ground and walk as close as we dared on some of the icy surfaces and see big flocks of swans. So,
Yeah.
Large cat, cougar. Cougars
yeah.
were very much a part of my childhood. I remember walking down the hill to the Nelson Road to get the school bus with my friend Victor. And, there was a cougar right there. And of course, we didn't know anything enough to be worried about them. I mean, here in Vancouver, it seems like cougars are always going after children. But I guess they had enough to eat there. But I have a character in my books who's obsessed with cougars, and she actually is built a bit from life. There was a woman who went around shooting at things and once shot someone's dog because she thought it was a cougar. So I couldn't not have her, of course, in my book. In my book, the person never actually manages to shoot a cougar. And I don't think this lady ever did either. I wonder, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, what we're starting to touch on too is danger, which is really great in mysteries, and not just animals, because if you live in these areas, you have lots of stories of bear encounters and things like that you've managed to come out unscathed, but hopefully, but also the very beauty of the natural environment, the deepness of the lakes, the ruggedness of the mountains. There's a lot of potential for people endangering themselves, doing what could be considered quite ordinary things, certainly quite natural things in the area. So something Dave alluded to earlier, there's an underbelly to these places where serious crime does take place, despite the gorgeous scenery. And I have to congratulate Dave on managing to sit in a beautiful meadow today with snow-capped mountains behind him. But there also is the danger, the potential danger in going into the mountains and going out on the lake.
That's actually true. And you also alluded to the kind of self-sufficiency angle of the area. And I think that self-sufficiency creates really strong characters as well. Right. And, they're a delight to write about, really, because they're all over the place. They're not, secluded in the downtown east side or anything, they're just everywhere. I can safely say that everyone I knew as a small child was a capital C character. And, among those, I think are people who've come there, searching for something, for fame and glory, getting the right mining kind of fortune and so on. And, there can be some pretty embittered, unhappy characters. There can be characters who are competing, characters who are stealing off other people's property and so on. That I think adds to that danger, that sense that, yeah, they're characters, but among characters can be people who are just a little, rocky on their mental pins.
Well, there's certainly, it's interesting when back in the day, and I'm going back before this century now, talking about some of the health reports that I was involved in writing or editing. There was a time, I'm thinking it was probably in the early 2000s, but it might have been even later, and it might still apply today, where in the West Kootenay, and I think in the Kootenays period, but I'll speak to the West Kootenay because I knew more about that there was a very high percentage of older people living independently, living in their homes and on their homesteads, people in their 80s on their equipment, mowing lawns and this sort of thing. And so there is a character, there's something there that I guess all of us really admire that does predominate, and that sort of strength and independence, and also, of course, again, you get into the isolation and danger factors. And gosh, Iona gets to write at a time when there weren't cell phones, so she can have people really stuck.
Yeah, no, that is the most amazing thing, actually. I mean, and how far you really are from things, even if you're only 30 miles up the lake in a small
Right.
community like
Right.
a Kings Cove or a Queens Bay.
Yeah.
You know, you're pretty far from a hospital. Yeah, no. And if your car goes down and nobody knows where you are, there's nothing you can do. You got to hope
And
somebody
it happens.
finds
Yeah.
you. And it
Yeah.
does happen. No, exactly.
Is it uncommon for people to go missing in those kind of areas? Like, I'm just thinking of North Vancouver and people getting lost in the mountains, and
Yes.
search and rescue have to go out so often.
Yeah.
I would imagine
Yeah.
there, like, you've got isolated people who maybe not checking in on you on a regular basis.
And
that-
we have a very active search and rescue there also. And it's a good point. And I mean, I'd like to think that perhaps people are a little better informed sometimes than hikers that just go off for the afternoon wearing, you know, flip-flops and tank tops and end up needing to be rescued in the North Shore Mountains. But it certainly happens. It certainly happens there too.
And yeah, and I'd say, and I need to Judy's point, I think, you know, the changes that have occurred, and I think, Iona, you were reflecting on it, but people, more and more people are coming here for the lifestyle now, which we're seeing a bit of a shift happening. So less coming here to do forestry or mining in the traditional sort of resource extraction industries, which largely built many of the communities. And so you have more and more people here because they want to be in the mountains and the backcountry. So I think, as you said, Judy, the search and rescue teams on both sides of East and West Kootenay can be very busy. I think, as you said, less because people are unprepared sort of from a gear perspective, and oftentimes they just get themselves into trouble in terms of either getting lost or they run into the natural problems that Iona mentioned, whether it's, you know, falling in a crevasse in a glacier or you know, falling off a cliff or something like those kinds of things tend to happen more because people are quite adventurous here because they're coming here to be in the mountains, I think.
Yeah.
A big factor when I was much younger was the whole kind of hippie back to the land thing, you know, in the 60s and 70s. And one of the things that came were isolated marijuana grow ups back when it was all very illegal. And that actually did create some danger. And I have a friend who swears that his mother died an unnatural death because she knew something about one of the grow ups and somebody sort of took her out. And so, you know, that's I don't think that's such a big factor now, but it certainly added an element of real danger to a community that up until then had really enjoyed a kind of, you know, Eden innocence in some ways, in terms of.
It's a very good point. And again, when I was working on public health, one of our concerns was making sure that when women had children, that they got the support that they needed. Because if there were situations where people, if they were in an illegal situation in terms of growing dope, they then they maybe didn't want the public health nurses to come and visit because there were things that were obvious. So that was a concern, and I can't resist giving you a little anecdote. When my girls, who are now women in their 40s, were brownies, I used to go and help out at Brownie Camp, which took place at Sanka Creek, which is just sort of going toward the East Kootenays. And we had a brown owl who had been doing the job for 35 years, and she needed a little rest during the day. So we would take the girls, the mothers would take the girls on a hike. And we had two little girls who left us for a moment to relieve themselves in the woods, and they came back with marijuana plants in plastic bags, and they said, "We found plants." So there was a lot of story of the great drug heist at Brownie because we had to report it to the police, and then we had to reassure the girls that they weren't in danger because, of course, they'd been taught how drugs were bad, and I remember one of the mothers saying to me, how do we say these people are just like us who
Right.
have left these plants in the woods and haven't had the chance to plant them yet. So lots of stories like that in the Kootenays.
I imagine, like you said too, you're very close to the border, so that might
Mhm.
also bring like
Oh, yes.
I'm sure Dave, well, you've written about it, like poaching and like
Yeah.
just drugs, maybe just a channel for drugs. Is that a problem up there, or is it so remote it's not really?
I can't really speak to today. I expect there's probably lots of things illegal moving back and forth across the border because a lot of the border is unguarded. I mean, there's various kinds of surveillance mechanisms that particularly the US uses in terms of things getting in there. But I have no doubt that things do move back and forth across the border from time to time. Because if you look at any of the areas, most of it is only a 6 meter wide strip of cut through some pretty tough terrain. So I know I've heard some stories from my RCMP and my conservation officer friends about things moving back and forth. So I'm sure that's still going on, even though marijuana itself is still legal up here. I'm sure there's lots of interesting things moving back and forth across the border,
Yeah.
which is interesting for some ideas. And as you said, I did do that in one of the stories I wrote, and I actually had the chance to go down and talk to one of the CBSA stations and kind of just pulled the border guard aside and said, if I was going to try and get something like this across the border legally, what would I do? And he first asked me for some identification,
Yeah.
and then kind of
That was when we had to visit Dave in jail for a
That's right.
while.
Thanks for the bail money, by the way, Judy. That was very helpful. But he did kind of one of these across the shoulder, and then he proceeded to tell me exactly how I might do it. And it was one of the most interesting little pieces of tidbits that I would not have got otherwise if I just walked in there and asked the question. So that was kind of fun.
Yeah.
Iona, your stories is 80 years ago, roughly 80 years ago. Was those elements of crime there in Nelson at that time, or is this
That's
a
a
relatively
really good question, and I don't, strictly speaking, know the answer to that, unfortunately. So, yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking in terms of drugs and firearms and things like that, and I really don't know. I don't know if anyone has a better idea about that at the time, because there were lots of other like interesting things going on. You had right after the war, you had the Japanese who had been interned around the areas there. And everyone would have expected they'd go back to the coast, but of course they weren't allowed back to even think of going back until 1949, which is years after the war was over. So a lot of people stayed on. You had the whole Doukhobor situation. So that Doukhobor situation with the Sons of Freedom, who began to, in the 50s, when I was a small child there, it was quite present. And in the 60s, the kind of Freedomite protests about their kids being taken off to school and being kept really interned themselves as well, the children. But those things actually began in the late 40s. There were already those kinds of rumblings and difficulties and setting fire to farms and nude protests and bombs and so on. So it's in relation to that kind of politics, I don't know whether there might not have been something coming back and forth across the border that would be of use to someone who was in the middle of a fairly, in some ways violent protest.
Well, Iona, you have written in, I guess it was your second to last book, because I've read them all, I can't just come up with the right title right away, but where you really explored what happened with the Sinixt people, where the border didn't exist for them. And
exactly. Yeah, that's such a good
explored that in such an interesting way. And that had implications for fisheries and salmon runs and things like that. So it is interesting. And when you mention the Sons of Freedom in particular, that sect of the Doukhobor population who wanted basically a peaceful place to farm and be left alone. They also wanted to educate their children themselves. And there were residential schools with the same sort of horror stories that we hear of it with Indigenous people. I knew people who had hidden under beds when people were coming to take them out, the RCMP, to send them to school. And they maybe would only see their parents intermittently, and there were pictures of parents behind fences to visit them and stuff. So there's certainly a lot of strife and difficulty, you know, related to community in the history there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would imagine a lot of people who move there for various reasons are really, a lot of them are going to be left alone. So
That's what they
regardless,
want. Yeah, no
They'd like to
question.
be, yeah.
Right?
yeah, and then you write a crime story where you have to meddle in their lives. Well, on occasion, you've taken, well, two of you have taken your stories outside of the region. So Iona and Dave, you've both written one book, I think each, where your main character left the Kootenays. How did leaving their safe zone change their story? And then Judy, I have a question for you later.
You go ahead, Iona, first.
Okay. Well, for me, I was looking really honestly for an excuse to set the action in Tucson, because I actually went to high school there, and I'm very, very, very attached to it. And before high school, I spent many years as a child in Mexico. So the whole desert kind of landscape to me is something that I really love. So it was interesting because, you know, if you're going to take a detective out of his natural environment and where he has actual power to act, then you have to work a little harder to find ways to have that activity be useful when they're outside of their own territory. And so I came up with the idea of a dishonest ex-Vancouver police chief moving down, or cop moving down to Tucson, and produced action where Lane could behave also outside of her own comfort zone, based on her human responses to things. So she, during the course of the time, gets to know the wife of the chief of police, or the assistant chief of police, who turns out to be a victim of abuse. And so she has no qualms whatsoever about trying to find a way to save her. And that story is actually based on a true story about my own mother when we lived in Mexico City. And she performed a similar rescue of a very much abused woman when we drove 36 hours to Texas from Mexico City to get her to safety. So, that taking them out of this area into another area. And the other thing about moving them out, and I don't know if you found this, Dave, is that you don't really know what the dangers are when you move out of your own zone. So Darling and Lane don't really know thoroughly what they're dealing with, the whole time. They don't know how big it can get.
Yeah, and I think I reinforce a lot of what Iona said. I think I found with my character that she was very, very comfortable with the Kootenays and the wildlife issues and land use issues and those kinds of things, getting a bit frustrated with the bureaucracy that she was working within. And so I really had that idea after, and my third book was actually set in Namibia, and I had been there once, and there was just one particular day when I remember thinking, what if I did take her, as you said, Iona, and take her out of that comfort zone, and then drop her into some place where everything was different. Not only the geography, the culture, the history, society in general, the languages, but also, as you said, Iona, she had no more power left in terms of her regular, her badge didn't work there anymore. But I think more importantly, too, thinking about it from a sort of colonial perspective, is that many of the African countries have always had various other nationalities. Pretty much every country in Europe have showed up there and kind of run the show for a while, usually often a very violent way. So there she was, a white woman showing up in a culture that was so very, very different from what she was used to. And she couldn't just show up and say, hi, I've got all the answers. she had really stepped back, which was a real tough thing for her to do, and say, I better just observe more and talk less and figure out how I can be much more effective in what I do. And I think that actually did her a lot of good by being forced to do that. So all the things that Iona said, plus just that extra layers of complexity and uncertainty. And as you said, Iona, a whole bunch of new dangers around things that could hurt and kill people in Africa that weren't present in the Canadian Rockies that she also had to be thinking about. So it was really fun on so many different levels to just throw them into a different circumstance. And then, like most of us, I didn't know how she was going to react. And so I let her tell me as the writing flowed out. And it was kind of fun to see how she reacted to some of those challenges.
So for you, Judy, because Stella hasn't left Nelson yet. Any thoughts of ever putting
Stella dipped her toe in returning to Vancouver and Give Out Creek. And that's where she had grown up in Nelson and then really escaped to the coast because there were lots of things that were not part of a happy life for her there. And she went back somewhat hesitatingly, but when she took a trip outside, she was able to be a bit freer in many ways from the constraints she was experiencing in Nelson, and including her involvement with Sergeant Ben McKean, the police officer that comes up in my stories. And it was interesting, I was at one of the book clubs in Nelson talking about the story, and there was someone there. Stella is doing a good turn by looking after an older friend to take him to Kelowna, and she has a choice to go back home or to carry on to Kelowna, which is about equidistant between Vancouver and Nelson. And this person in the book club was saying, as she said at that intersection, she was saying, no, don't turn right, turn left, because she was worried about her getting into trouble with her attraction to the police officer. With my stories, I'm thinking about this a lot because I'm presently working on the third story in which Stella is going to come to quite a crossroads at. And I think in the fourth story, she has to leave. And I think she's going to have to travel quite far. So it's something I'm thinking about a lot. And I love that. I mean, we all need to do that in terms of getting out of our comfort zones in some ways. I've done that personally a few times in my life. I'm doing it right now. But I think one of the reasons we write is because we like to explore these basic sorts of questions in life, right? And I know for myself, the older I get, the more I have that desire to do that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and as a writer, we sort of have the responsibility of actually traveling to where we set our books.
Oh,
I think all writers
Oh,
agree on that. So yeah, so my wife's like, let's do your next one in Hawaii.
It's all about research.
Well, you bring up a good point though, Eric, because I've heard people say, oh, well, nowadays, you know, we can travel anywhere we want to through the internet. But the interesting things are the interesting details are the things that you pick up when you are somewhere, the things that make the story real. I can't imagine writing about someone being somewhere without actually being there.
Oh yeah, no, that's
Right.
absolutely
Earth
true.
below your feet.
Lane has gone to England,
Yeah.
at least once, which is where she came from. So that was fun. Again, she has no power, but she has a lot of connections there that are helpful to her. And I'm sending her back there again for April's book. So, you know, yeah, it is funny because I'm the one who is writing in a country I haven't been in, which is the past. You know, the past is another country.
Right.
So, you know, there's a lot of other types of complications there because I'm setting the books really before I was born, but only just before I was born, you know. So I have the culture of my parents,
Yes.
the culture of an isolated community that, unlike a big urban center, isn't rushing into the future, but rather is settling very comfortably in a rattan chair of the past. And so, you know, I'm sure the culture I saw as a child was a pre-war culture. I don't think there's any question about that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. And in fact, I had the opportunity to have a little trip with Iona to Queens Bay / Kings Cove when she came and visited me while I was still living in Nelson. And it was quite fun visiting the connections that you have made there or maintained, and some of whom are people that I know, but all of the people we spoke to are trying to maintain more traditional ways of life too. So that there is an interest in that among a lot of the people who do kind of go back to the land, and it's real. Even you know, I can just
now,
see
absolutely.
the strong link between your historical stories and the people that are still living that life.
I think there is, yeah.
There's also an interesting connection with Iona and I are sort of writing with female protagonists living in two different eras in much the same place, but they also have love interests in the Nelson Police Department, which existed in Iona's time and still exists. It existed.
I think it's the oldest,
for all those years.
Isn't it one of the oldest police departments in the country?
Well, yeah, certainly in BC, in terms of an independent police department. I'm not sure if it is the oldest, but I think it is, at least in BC. I wouldn't be surprised if there weren't someone in the East, just being an older part of Canada. But yeah. So of course, Iona's police officers have to take the ferry to get across the lake, whereas my characters can ride their bikes across the bridge.
I had a lovely note from a woman just yesterday who said she loves reading about those ferry rides because she lived there and had to do that. And her husband was the chief engineer in the building of the Big Orange Bridge, which now is what crosses the water. So that was quite
right.
fun.
Oh, that would be very interesting. And in fact, in the area, we still have inland ferries. And
oh, absolutely. I took a ride on the Harrop ferry last time I was there, just to get a sense of the time, because it's about the same width as that Nelson span.
That's
North Shore into
very
town.
small. It's on a cable.
It's on a cable. Yeah, goes back and forth all the time.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Well, we discussed this question. Let's make it our last question, maybe. Of how important setting is. So we had this question, I gave it to you a little earlier so you can warm up, because I know it can be a contentious question. And Judy, you started, so I'll start with you again, and you could sort of repeat what you said before. In the importance of setting, if in theory, Netflix or Amazon Prime came knocking on your door saying, we love your series, the only hitch is we'll even film it in Nelson, but we're going to set it in like Montana or Washington State, an American setting, essentially. Would that be a major hurdle for you? Would you say no, or would you just happily take the money and do with it as you wish?
I did have a situation once where I came very, very close to signing with an agent from San Diego that was very complimentary about my first story, but thought the setting was a bit of a problem. It would be better if it were in the States. And at the time, and a lot of people would say it was naive of me, but I thought, but it couldn't be anywhere else, because I've never been anywhere in northern Washington or Idaho or Montana where that was Nelson, you know. But it's certainly done in film a lot of times. And I don't know if you remember Steve Martin's movie Roxanne, which really put Nelson on the map many, many years ago. But that's exactly what they did. They filmed a lot of it in Nelson, but they called it Nelson. I think they called it Nelson, Washington. They used the name. So, but I think it's great if we. I guess it's part of our authentic storytelling if we don't pretend that we're writing about is anywhere else, because there's just so many factors that make it what it is. To take Nelson as an example, the relative isolation, which makes it quite a self-sufficient community. It's you can get anything you need there. You could stay there without going anywhere else. That has the juxtaposition of the underbelly that's part of modern society, but just outrageously beautiful scenery that is uplifting. So yeah, I'd like to hear what the others say about that too. Whether you'd be
yeah, I mean, I really hope that, you know, serious writing for Canadians has grown up enough in the American mind that people are not saying that so often. Though in my first book, I was criticized by an American reviewer for some sort of a contest. That's when I was still self-published. You know, you need to set these in the US. No one's interested in Canada. That's a quote. No one's interested in Canada. But in fact, you know, certainly my books are grounded in the landscape, in the history there. You know, you can't have, I mean, you could have the Sinixt nation, for example, in the States, because half their territory is
around Colville, yeah.
But everything else, you know, is absolutely of a place. I can't imagine, you know, I mean, I think we have to see ourselves as serious writers who are writing about something that we really, really know on some level, and it's our homeland. I don't know. What do you think, Dave?
Well, to be completely honest, I would answer Erik's question first by saying, depends how much money. Because that could make a difference in my answer. That is being honest. But I fully agree with what Iona and Judy have said. I mean, I think that the unique aspect of this place, I mean, even, you know, where I am in Cranbrook, we're only, as I said, half an hour north of the border, really, into Montana. And there are many physical similarities. It's still part of the Rocky Mountain Trench. There's a Rockies on one side, the Purcells on the other. So from a sort of visual perspective, you could easily move some of the stories down to a Kalispell or a Whitefish in Montana, places like that. But I think that there's, as you know, the others have said, there's so many unique sort of social and cultural and other kinds of pieces that are really very different, that the kinds of conversations we'd have up here, the kinds of way we would deal with land use issues, the kinds of way we deal with crimes even, and even the politics, you know, of the places are just so very different that it would be very difficult. The nature of the story, I think, would have to change pretty dramatically, for sure. And so I think I like what you said, Iona. I mean, I think we should take great pride in the fact that we're writing about some very unique places, and it would be very difficult and pretty inauthentic to ship them to somewhere else. The nature of the story would change enough that I'd have some struggles with it for sure.
Yeah, and in our off-screen recording, we also discussed, obviously, there's a Canadian writer who's very much helping set her stories in Canada. So, and I'm watching her sort of book launches as she goes. Yeah. As Louise Penny goes from different book launches on Facebook, and she's like a legit rock star, and nobody's going to tell her not to set her stories in Canada.
And I don't think we should sell Americans short, or anybody else outside of the country. People actually are interested in Canada. I get letters from American readers all the time who absolutely love them, have told me they've come up here specifically to the Nelson area because of the books. So, you know, I think they're sophisticated as well. I think perhaps the agents and reviewers who think we ought to set them in the US perhaps are lagging behind, you know, the real interest of the Americans.
Any final thoughts?
Well, I'd like to say thank you for bringing us together to have this chat, Erik, because I feel a little bit of renewed excitement about what we're all doing. And it was such a treat to get to have a conversation with you and Dave and Iona again. We haven't done that for a little while.
Mhm.
It's really so much fun for writers to get together and discuss these sorts of issues.
And I'd add to that and say I have huge respect for both Judy and Iona, and this has been such a pleasure today to spend a little bit of time on screen with you and reconnect and have this great conversation. It's been so much fun. Thank you so much, Erik, for making this happen.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm just going to ditto everything. Thank you so much. It has been an absolute pleasure. And the only thing that would have made it better is if we'd been all in the same room and had a cocktail.
Here,
Other
here.
than that, it's been an
Here, here.
absolute pleasure.
Well, those events are happening again. It's nice to know.
Yes, yes.
Also, I wanted to give credit where it's due. This subject was your brainchild.
Oh, Judy and I had this
Oh,
brainchild.
wow.
Did we not?
Okay, you brought it to me.
We've been talking about it for some time, yes,
We
Thank you.
have, and it's so delightful to have Dave with us.
Oh,
yes.
thank you.
Absolutely. It's been
My
brilliant.
pleasure.
And in my head, like prepping, I wrote questions and I didn't actually even read half of them. But part of me was like, can we really talk about the Kootenays for an hour
Oh,
and keep it interesting?
Wow.
And apparently we can. If we
Well,
just
now
prove
you
you're
know,
right.
Erik, now that you've learned more about the Kootenays.
we've only
Yes,
just
you'll
scratched
have
the
to go
surface.
there, Erik.
We've been traveling a lot in BC in the last few years, but we've been going more to the island. So maybe we will turn, as Judy said, we'll turn right this time.
Give me a call when you come through.
Excellent. So everyone watching, thank you very much for staying along. And to my guests, thank you, all of you, Iona, Judy, and Dave. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.